The death of Elias spread quickly through the human colonies, whispered in hushed tones and shared in encrypted transmissions. The Galactic Empire, in its arrogance, had overlooked the significance of their actions. They had not merely killed a boy, they had lit a fuse. Among those who received the news was Dorian Kael, a man whose name still echoed in war councils and battlefields long after his supposed retirement. Dorian was not the kind of man to retire peacefully. His years of service had honed him into a ruthless strategist, one who understood the weight of sacrifice and the cost of war. But Elias had been his sanctuary, the one piece of his life untouched by the cruelty of the galaxy. The message of his son's death arrived late in the evening, delivered by a courier who could barely meet his eyes. Kael read the report in silence, his expression unreadable. Inside, however, a storm brewed. This wasn't just the loss of his son. It was an act of war. The Empire's soldiers had executed a child without trial, without reason, and without mercy. His child. For a moment, Kael allowed himself the indulgence of grief, sitting alone in the dim light of his quarters. But grief was a weakness he couldn't afford. The galaxy had taken much from him, but it wouldn't take his resolve. Kael stood, his mind already shifting to the familiar patterns of strategy and retaliation. He sent word to his closest allies, calling for an emergency council. These were men and women who had fought alongside him in humanity's darkest hours, people who would follow him without hesitation. Within hours, they arrived, their faces grim as they learned of what had happened. "We can't let this stand," one of them said. "We won't," Kael replied, his voice cold and steady. "The Empire made a mistake, and they will answer for it." The plan began to take shape. Kael was a man of precision, not reckless vengeance. Striking the Empire directly would be suicide, but dismantling its foundation piece by piece was a task well within his capabilities. He would exploit their overconfidence, turn their arrogance into a weapon. Every mistake they made would be amplified, every vulnerability exposed. Kael's first step was to identify the patrol ship responsible for his son's death. It wasn't difficult. The Empire's soldiers operated with a level of arrogance that left them predictable. The patrol commander had filed a routine report, unaware that his actions had been noted by the wrong set of eyes. Kael studied the report, memorizing every detail. As his allies prepared for the mission ahead, Kael allowed himself one last moment of reflection. He thought of Elias, of the boy's wide-eyed curiosity and unshakable optimism. The galaxy had taken that from him, but it wouldn't go unanswered. Kael's grief had been replaced with resolve, and the Empire would soon learn what it meant to cross humanity. Dorian Kael moved with precision, his grief buried under layers of cold calculation. The first move was always the most important. He needed intelligence, details on the patrol that killed his son, their route, and the chain of command that allowed such reckless violence. Through carefully hidden human networks, Kael obtained the data he needed. The patrol ship's logs were sloppy, filled with self-congratulatory notes about neutralizing a potential insurgent threat. The arrogance disgusted him, but it confirmed his suspicions. The Empire hadn't even realized the magnitude of their mistake. Kael wasted no time. He issued coded orders to his network of loyalists spread across human colonies and sympathetic alien factions. Supplies were gathered, weapons prepared, and ships outfitted for covert operations. For years, Kael had worked to keep humanity united despite the Empire's oppression, creating a web of alliances and hidden bases. Now, that web would serve a new purpose: retribution. The first target was simple: the patrol ship itself. The soldiers who had killed Elias were still stationed on a nearby Empire outpost, operating as if they were untouchable. Kael knew better. He studied their patterns, noting their weaknesses. Empire troops relied on their superior technology and numbers, rarely expecting precision strikes from what they considered a fractured and disorganized species. Kael assembled a small team of operatives, handpicked for their skills. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were former miners, engineers, or smugglers, people who had lived under the Empire's boot and learned to adapt. Under Kael's command, they became a lethal force. Each one of them knew the stakes: This wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message. The operation began under the cover of night. The patrol ship's guards, complacent and inattentive, were neutralized without a single alarm raised. Kael's team moved like shadows, disabling the ship's engines and downloading its encrypted logs. Before dawn, the ship was little more than a smoldering wreck, its crew taken prisoner or eliminated. Kael interrogated the surviving officers personally. His questions were precise, aimed not at their individual guilt but at uncovering the larger mechanisms of the Empire's control. He learned of supply routes, garrison locations, and the internal politics that kept the Empire's hierarchy fragile. Every piece of information was a tool, and Kael wielded it with ruthless efficiency. Word of the attack spread quickly. Human colonies that had once lived in fear began to whisper of Kael's return. He was a symbol now, not just a father seeking vengeance, but a leader uniting humanity against an oppressive force. His name inspired both hope and fear, depending on which side of the conflict you stood. The Empire, however, remained blind to the growing storm. Their leaders dismissed the attack as an isolated incident, the work of desperate rebels rather than a coordinated effort. They had underestimated humanity before, and they would do so again. For Kael, that arrogance was their greatest weakness. Each step he took was calculated, each victory a prelude to something larger. The Empire didn't realize it yet, but their reckoning had already begun. The attack on the patrol ship marked only the beginning. Dorian Kael had no intention of letting the Empire recover from their complacency. Every move he made was deliberate, aimed at weakening their grip while building humanity's strength. With the stolen data from the wrecked ship, Kael identified key vulnerabilities in the Empire's sprawling infrastructure, weak points that could be exploited with precision. The first target was an Empire supply depot located on a barren moon. It was a critical hub for refueling and arming patrol fleets in the sector, yet its defenses were minimal. The Empire never considered the possibility that anyone would dare attack it. Kael's team, bolstered by volunteers from nearby colonies, struck hard and fast. Using repurposed mining equipment and retrofitted freighters, they overwhelmed the outpost before reinforcements could arrive. Supplies were seized, and the depot was reduced to rubble. The operation sent shockwaves through the region. The Empire, long accustomed to viewing humanity as a minor inconvenience, began to take notice. Their responses, however, were predictable. Patrols were increased, checkpoints established, and more soldiers deployed to human-controlled areas. Kael anticipated this reaction. The increased military presence stretched their resources thin, leaving other installations vulnerable. Kael's forces didn't confront the Empire head-on. Instead, they employed hit-and-run tactics, striking isolated outposts and disappearing before the Empire could mount a proper defense. Every engagement was a lesson in human ingenuity. Empire technology was superior, but it was rigid, designed for overwhelming force rather than adaptability. Kael turned that rigidity against them, using scavenged equipment and improvised tactics to outmaneuver larger, better-armed forces. As the resistance grew, so did its ranks. News of Kael's campaign spread far beyond human colonies, reaching alien species who had also suffered under the Empire's rule. Many offered their support, providing resources and intelligence in exchange for the promise of a future free from oppression. For the first time, a unified front against the Empire began to take shape, and Kael stood at its center. Empire officials scrambled to contain the unrest. They labeled Kael a terrorist, issuing bounties and dispatching elite units to track him down. But Kael remained elusive, always one step ahead. His movements were calculated to sow confusion and fear within the Empire's ranks. He struck where they least expected, targeting communications relays and supply chains to cripple their ability to respond effectively. For the Empire's soldiers, morale began to falter. The idea of human resistance had once been laughable, but now it was an ever-present threat. Patrols ventured out with trepidation, unsure if they would return. Commanders grew paranoid, issuing conflicting orders as they struggled to maintain control. Kael's campaign wasn't just dismantling their infrastructure, it was eroding their confidence. Kael knew this was only the beginning. Each victory was a step toward a larger goal, a calculated escalation designed to force the Empire into a position of weakness. He wasn't fighting for revenge alone anymore. This was about survival, about ensuring that no other child would suffer the same fate as Elias. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and they were beginning to realize the cost of their arrogance. The Empire's grip on the sector was beginning to loosen, but Dorian Kael knew the battle was far from over. Every strike, every victory had been carefully planned to lead to this moment. His ultimate target was the Empire's central command station in the region, a massive fortress orbiting a distant planet. It served as the nerve center for military operations, housing high-ranking officials and vast stores of intelligence. Destroying it wouldn't just cripple the Empire's control. It would send a message that humanity would no longer be subjugated. Kael's network had grown into a formidable force, composed of humans and alien allies who had suffered under the Empire's rule. Together, they devised a plan that was equal parts audacious and precise. The Empire's command station was heavily fortified, with layers of defenses designed to repel entire fleets. A direct assault would be suicide. Instead, Kael relied on the one thing the Empire had consistently underestimated: human ingenuity. Using captured Empire codes, Kael's team infiltrated the station's communication network, planting false data to create the illusion of a routine maintenance operation. A disguised transport ship, filled with Kael's operatives, was granted clearance to dock. The deception held long enough for them to breach the station's internal defenses, striking at key systems before alarms were raised. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Kael's forces moved with surgical precision, targeting power generators and command terminals to disable the station's operations. Empire soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but their reliance on rigid protocols worked against them. Kael's team adapted to every countermeasure, outmaneuvering their opponents at every turn. Kael himself led the charge into the station's control room. The Empire's regional commander, a figure shrouded in authority and arrogance, stood waiting. For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence, the weight of the conflict distilled into that single confrontation. "You think this will change anything?" the commander sneered. "You're nothing but an insect, swatting at a giant." Kael's reply was calm, measured. "And yet here you are, facing extinction." The ensuing fight was brief but decisive. Kael's team overpowered the remaining guards and secured the station's data core, downloading vital intelligence that would aid their cause in future battles. As the command station systems began to fail, Kael issued the order to evacuate. His forces retreated just as the station's self-destruct protocols, triggered by their sabotage, activated. From the safety of their ships, Kael's forces watched as the command station erupted in a fiery explosion, its debris scattering across the void. The Empire's most vital asset in the region was gone, and with it, their control over countless systems. The victory was more than strategic, it was symbolic. Across the galaxy, oppressed colonies and alien species took notice. Kael had proven that the Empire was not invincible, that resistance was not futile. Humanity, once dismissed as weak and insignificant, had become a force capable of challenging the galaxy's greatest power. As Kael stood aboard his flagship, watching the remnants of the command station drift into oblivion, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. This wasn't the end of the war, but it was a turning point. The Empire had taken his son, but in doing so, they had awakened something far greater. They had united humanity, ignited a fire that would burn until the galaxy was free. Dorian Kael wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. He was fighting for a future where no one would live in fear of the Empire again.